She was the billionaire's biggest enemy, until one night destiny made them fall into each other. Before we begin, drop a comment telling us which city you're watching from. And once the story ends, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Oh, and make sure to follow our channel for more stories like this. Now, sit back and enjoy every detail. Some people inherit money, others inherit power. But Sutton Hale inherited a war she never asked to fight. The elevator climbed silently toward the 42nd floor of Carrick Hale Industries, each floor marking another layer of the empire her father had built with his best friend. Sutton pressed her palm against the cool metal wall, feeling the familiar weight in her chest, the same weight that had settled there the day she realized she'd spend the rest of her life sharing power with the one person who made her blood boil, Weston Carrick. The elevator dinged softly, and the doors slid open to reveal the pristine marble lobby of the executive floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of downtown Seattle, where morning fog still clung to the Space Needle like a ghost refusing to leave. But Sutton barely noticed the beauty anymore. This place had become a battlefield. "Good morning, Ms. Hale," chirped Beverly, the receptionist, her voice carrying that careful neutrality that everyone in the building had perfected. "Mr. Carrick is already in conference room A." Of course he was. Weston had probably been there since 6 a.m., reviewing quarterly reports and calculating efficiency metrics while she'd been stuck in traffic, thinking about the homeless woman she'd seen at the bus stop and wondering if their company's success meant anything, if people were still sleeping in doorways. "Thank you, Beverly." Sutton adjusted her blazer and walked down the hallway, her heels clicking against the polished concrete floors. The walls were lined with framed photographs, her father and Weston's father at groundbreaking ceremonies, award dinners, and ribbon cuttings. Two men who had dreamed of changing the world, one innovative solution at a time. If only they could see their children now. Sutton paused outside conference room A, taking a breath that tasted like coffee and determination. Through the glass walls she could see him, Weston Carrick, 36 years old, sitting at the head of the table like he owned the entire world. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his navy suit impeccable, and his attention completely focused on the laptop screen in front of him. Even from here she could see the slight furrow in his brow, the way his jaw tensed when he was deep in thought. He was annoyingly handsome, and even more annoyingly brilliant. She hated that she noticed. The door opened before she could knock, and Weston looked up, his steel-gray eyes meeting hers with the same cool assessment they'd held since college. "You're 7 minutes late." "Good morning to you too, Weston." Sutton stepped into the room, setting her leather portfolio on the table. Traffic was brutal. There was an accident on I-5 and the traffic report at 6:15 showed clear roads. He didn't look away from his screen. "If you'd left your apartment at 7:40 instead of 8, you would have avoided the construction zone on Pine Street." Sutton felt her jaw clench. This was how every day started, with Weston treating her like an inefficient variable in his perfectly calculated equation. "Not everyone lives their life according to traffic algorithms, Weston. Successful people do." She pulled out her chair and sat down, fighting the urge to say what she really thought about his definition of success. "Shall we begin?" Weston finally looked up, and for just a moment something flickered in his eyes. Something that might have been exhaustion, or frustration, or something deeper. But it disappeared so quickly that Sutton wondered if she'd imagined it. "The quarterly board meeting is in 3 weeks, he said, sliding a printed report across the table. "Revenue is up 18%. Operational costs are down 12%, and our sustainability initiatives have exceeded projections by 37%. Sutton glanced at the numbers, impressed despite herself. "That's actually incredible." "Don't sound so surprised." There was the faintest hint of a smile at the corner of his mouth. "I do occasionally know what I'm doing." "I never said you didn't." She flipped through the pages, noting the detailed breakdowns and projections. Weston might be infuriating, but he was undeniably good at his job. "What about the employee satisfaction surveys?" The smile disappeared. "Down 4%. 4%? Sutton looked up sharply. "Weston, that's nearly 300 people who are less happy at work than they were 6 months ago. It's within acceptable parameters." "Acceptable to whom?" "To anyone who understands that running a billion-dollar company requires making difficult decisions." His voice was flat, businesslike. "We can't save the world and hold everyone's hand. We can't save anything if our own employees hate working here." Sutton set the report down harder than necessary. "Our fathers didn't build this company so we could treat people like spreadsheet entries." Weston's eyes darkened. "Don't." Don't what? Don't use them as ammunition in whatever point you're trying to make. He closed his laptop with a sharp click. Our fathers built this company to solve problems, not to win popularity contests. They built it because they cared about people. They built it because they were smart enough to know that caring without strategy is just wishful thinking. Sutton stared at him across the polished table, feeling the familiar fire building in her chest. This was how it always went. Her heart against his head, her hope against his logic, her dreams against his data. And somehow, despite sharing the same blood, the same legacy, the same enormous responsibility, they could never find common ground. The Toronto conference is next week, Weston said finally, his voice carefully neutral again. We're presenting together on ethical leadership and innovation. Joy. The word came out more sarcastically than she'd intended. Try to contain your enthusiasm. He stood up, gathering his papers with mechanical precision. The presentation is at 2 p.m. on Thursday. We'll fly out Wednesday morning. I'll be there. Weston paused at the door, and for a moment Sutton thought he might say something else. Something real. Something that wasn't filtered through corporate speak and careful distance. But he just nodded once. Try not to be late to the airport. The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving Sutton alone with the morning sunlight streaming through the windows and the lingering scent of his cologne. She slumped back in her chair, staring at the photographs on the wall, their fathers young and hopeful, shaking hands at the company's founding. What would they think of this endless Cold War between their children? Sutton's phone buzzed with a text from her assistant. Reminder, staff meeting at 10 a.m. Also, there's a woman in the lobby asking about job opportunities. She doesn't have an appointment, but she's been waiting for 2 hours. She smiled, the first genuine smile of the morning. This was why she did this job. Not for the board meetings or the quarterly reports, but for the 2-hour waits in lobbies and the hope in people's eyes when they talked about their dreams. But as she headed toward the elevator, she couldn't shake the image of Weston's face when she'd mentioned their fathers. For just a second he'd looked less like the cold, calculating CEO and more like someone carrying a weight too heavy for one person to bear, just like she was. The woman in the lobby had calloused hands and hope in her eyes. Two things that reminded Sutton why she'd never be able to think like Weston. I know I don't have an appointment, the woman said, clutching a worn folder against her chest. But I heard your company hires people who, well, people like me. Sutton studied her visitor, mid-40s, graying brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, clothes clean but obviously second-hand. Her name tag read, "Hello, I'm Marisol," in careful handwriting. People like you? Sutton asked, gently settling into the chair across from her in the small conference room off the main lobby. People who've made mistakes. Marisol's voice was quiet but steady. I was in prison for 3 years. Got out 8 months ago. Been working at a diner downtown, but I studied computer programming through the prison education program, and I thought maybe... She trailed off, then straightened her shoulders. I thought maybe your company meant it when you said everyone deserves a second chance. Sutton felt something tighten in her chest. The company's mission statement, written by her father, had always included language about redemption and opportunity. But when was the last time they'd actually hired someone with a criminal record? Tell me about your programming experience, she said. For the next 20 minutes, Marisol walked Sutton through her portfolio. Simple but elegant websites, a basic app for tracking community garden plots, clean code that showed real talent and dedication. Her hands shook slightly as she explained each project, but her voice grew stronger with every line of code she described. This is impressive work, Sutton said, and meant it. Really impressive. Does that mean... It means I'd like you to meet with our IT director this afternoon. Sutton pulled out her phone. Let me call down and... The conference room door opened without warning and Weston stepped inside, his expression shifting from neutral to annoyed as he took in the scene. Sutton, we need to discuss the Denver project timeline. His eyes flicked to Marisol dismissively. When you're finished here. Actually, I'd like you to meet someone. Sutton stood up, noting how Marisol seemed to shrink under Weston's cold stare. Weston Carrick. This is Marisol Santos. She's a talented programmer who's interested in joining our team. Weston's gaze moved to the folder in Marisol's hands, then back to Sutton. Does she have an appointment? She's been waiting for 2 hours, Sutton said evenly. I thought that showed initiative. It shows poor planning. He turned to Marisol with the kind of polite smile that never reached his eyes. Ms. Santos, I'm sure you understand that we have established hiring procedures. If you'd like to apply for a position, please visit our website and submit your materials through the proper channels. Marisol's cheeks flushed red. Of course. I'm sorry for bothering you. She started gathering her papers with fumbling hands. You're not bothering anyone, Sutton said quickly, shooting Weston a warning look. I was just about to call Tony in IT to schedule you an interview. That won't be necessary. Weston's voice had that final corporate tone that Sutton had learned to hate. All hiring decisions go through HR first, and all candidates need to pass our standard background screening process. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Marisol's hand stilled on her folder, and Sutton saw the exact moment hope died in her eyes. I see. Marisol stood up slowly, her dignity intact, but her spirit clearly crushed. Thank you for your time, Ms. Hale. I appreciate you listening to me. Marisol, wait. But she was already walking toward the door, her shoulders set in a way that said she'd expected this rejection, but had dared to hope anyway. When the door closed behind her, Sutton turned on Weston with fury blazing in her chest. What the hell was that? That was me preventing you from making a hiring decision based on emotion instead of policy. He moved to the window, hands clasped behind his back. We have procedures for a reason. She's talented. She's also a convicted felon. She served her time. And statistically, she's 43% more likely to— Stop. Sutton held up her hand, feeling sick. Just stop. Don't you dare reduce that woman to a statistic. Weston turned around, and for a moment she saw something flicker across his face. Something that might have been regret. But it was gone so quickly she couldn't be sure. This company employs over 3,000 people, he said quietly. Every single one of them depends on us making smart decisions. Safe decisions. Safe for whom? For everyone. Bullshit. The word came out harder than she'd intended, but she didn't care. You didn't even look at her work. You didn't ask about her experience or her qualifications. You saw someone you deemed risky and wrote her off. I protected this company. You protected your own comfort level. Sutton stepped closer, anger making her reckless. When did you become so afraid of taking chances on people? Something dark flashed in Weston's eyes. The day I realized that other people's second chances could destroy everything our fathers built. The words hit her like a physical blow. Sutton stared at him, seeing not the composed CEO but something raw and guarded underneath. What happened? She asked quietly. Nothing happened. He straightened his tie, composure sliding back into place like armor. I simply learned to think with my head instead of my heart. That's not thinking, Weston, that's hiding. He looked at her for a long moment, and Sutton had the strange feeling that he was deciding whether to say something true. But then his phone buzzed, and the moment shattered. The Denver team is waiting for our call, he said, pulling out his phone. Are you coming? Sutton wanted to say no. She wanted to run after Marisol, to offer her the job anyway, to prove that not everyone at Carrick Hale Industries had forgotten what compassion looked like. Instead, she followed Weston down the hallway, watching his perfect posture and wondering when exactly they'd become enemies instead of partners. But as they passed the lobby windows, she caught a glimpse of Marisol standing at the bus stop across the street, folder still clutched against her chest, staring up at their building with an expression that looked like heartbreak. And Sutton realized that somewhere between protecting the company and protecting himself, Weston had forgotten the most important thing their fathers had taught them. Sometimes the biggest risk is not taking one at all. The storage room on the 38th floor smelled like dust and forgotten dreams. Sutton hadn't meant to end up here. She'd been looking for the archived employee files from 2018, trying to find documentation of their last successful rehabilitation hire, when she'd taken a wrong turn and stumbled into what looked like a corporate time capsule. Cardboard boxes lined metal shelves from floor to ceiling, each labeled with dates going back to the company's founding. But it wasn't the files that caught her attention. It was the framed photograph sitting on a dusty desk in the corner. Her father and Weston's father, arms thrown around each other's shoulders, standing in front of a half-built office building with matching grins and rolled-up sleeves. They couldn't have been more than 30, young and hungry, and absolutely certain they were going to change the world. God, you were so young, she whispered, tracing her finger along the glass. They both were. Sutton spun around to find Weston standing in the doorway, his usually perfect hair slightly mussed and his tie loosened. He looked tired, more tired than she'd ever seen him. I didn't hear you come in, she said. Beverly told me you were looking for old employee records. He stepped into the room, his eyes fixed on the photograph. I thought you might need help finding them. I was trying to prove a point about Marisol. She set the frame back down carefully, but I got distracted. Weston moved closer, and for the first time in years they stood side by side without tension crackling between them. The storage room was small enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and clean that shouldn't have been comforting but somehow was. "I remember this picture," he said quietly. "It was taken the day they signed the lease for the first office. Dad brought me to work that afternoon because my nanny called in sick. How old were you?" 8, maybe 9. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I spent the whole day sitting in a corner reading comic books and watching them plan out office layouts on napkins." Sutton tried to imagine a young Weston, small and quiet, watching his father build an empire from scratch. It was hard to reconcile with the man standing beside her now, controlled, calculating, seemingly unbreakable. "My dad used to bring me in on Saturdays," she said. "I'd sit at his desk and pretend to make important phone calls while he caught up on paperwork. I remember, you had a pink plastic briefcase." She looked at him in surprise. "You remember that? You were very serious about it. You'd march around the office, telling anyone who'd listen that you were going to be the boss of everything when you grew up." Despite everything, Sutton found herself smiling. "I can't believe you remember that." "I remember a lot of things." His voice was softer than she'd heard it in years. "I remember the Christmas party when you were 16 and you got food poisoning from the shrimp. I remember graduation day, when your dad cried during your speech about environmental responsibility. I remember the day he died, and how you stood at the podium during the memorial service and promised everyone that his work would continue." The words hit her like a punch to the chest. She'd forgotten that Weston had been there that day, had seen her at her most vulnerable moment. "I remember your father's funeral too," she said quietly. "You didn't cry. Not once. Even when they lowered the casket." "No." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I didn't." "Why not?" For a long moment he didn't answer. Then he reached past her to pick up another photograph from the shelf, this one of the 4 of them at a company barbecue. Their fathers grilling hamburgers while teenage Sutton and Weston sat at opposite ends of a picnic table, both trying very hard to look like they didn't care about being photographed together. "Because crying wouldn't have brought him back," he said finally, "and the company needed someone who could think clearly. You were 22 years old, Weston. You were allowed to grieve." "Was I?" He set the photograph down with careful precision. "Because I seem to remember having to step into board meetings 3 days after the funeral, with everyone watching to see if the kid could handle his father's legacy. I remember having to make decisions that affected thousands of people while I was still figuring out how to sleep without nightmares." Sutton stared at him, seeing something she'd never seen before. Not the polished CEO, but the young man who'd had to grow up too fast, who'd learned to bury his emotions so deep that maybe he'd forgotten how to feel them at all. "I didn't know," she said softly. "Of course you didn't. You were dealing with your own grief." He turned to face her, and his eyes held a weariness that went bone deep. "But you got to fall apart, Sutton. You got to cry at board meetings and make emotional decisions and have people pat your shoulder and tell you it would get easier. I got to be the responsible one. That's not fair." "No," he agreed. "It's not, but it's what happened." They stood in the dusty silence, surrounded by the ghosts of their father's ambitions and their own complicated history. Sutton felt like she was seeing Weston clearly for the first time, not as the enemy she'd been fighting for years, but as someone who'd been carrying the same impossible weight she had, just in a different way. "The woman today," she said, "Marisol, you didn't reject her because of statistics, did you?" Weston's smile was bitter. "No, I rejected her because 5 years ago, I took a chance on someone with a criminal record, someone who seemed genuine and desperate for a second opportunity, someone a lot like her." "What happened?" "He embezzled $40,000 and disappeared, left behind a wife and 2 kids who had no idea what he'd been doing." Weston leaned against the shelf, suddenly looking every one of his 36 years. "The wife called me crying, asking if there was any way to get the money back because they were about to lose their house. I had to tell her that her husband, the man she'd trusted, the man I'd trusted, had probably been planning it from the day we hired him." Sutton felt something cold settle in her stomach. "Weston, so no, I don't take chances on people anymore. Because when you're responsible for 3,000 jobs, you can't afford to let your heart overrule your head." He straightened up, the mask sliding back into place. "That's the difference between us, Sutton. You still believe people are basically good. I've learned that sometimes they're not." He was almost to the door when she called after him. "What if you're wrong about Marisol?" He paused without turning around. "What if you are?" And then he was gone, leaving Sutton alone with the photographs and the dust and the sudden uncomfortable realization that maybe, just maybe, She'd been fighting the wrong enemy all along. The first-class cabin of Flight 447 to Toronto felt smaller than usual with Weston sitting 3 feet away. Sutton stared out the airplane window at the clouds below, trying to focus on the presentation notes in her lap instead of the memory of yesterday's conversation in the storage room. But every few minutes she found herself glancing sideways at him, noting the way he held his coffee cup, the slight tension in his shoulders, the fact that he'd been staring at the same page of his business magazine for the past 10 minutes. "You're not actually reading that," she said finally. Weston looked up, and for a split second she saw something unguarded in his expression before he composed himself. "Excuse me. The article about cryptocurrency markets. You've been on the same page for 10 minutes, and I happen to know you read faster than that." He closed the magazine and set it aside. "I was thinking. About the presentation. About a lot of things." The flight attendant appeared beside them with practiced deficiency. "Can I get you anything else before we begin our descent?" "I'm fine, thank you," Sutton said. The woman moved on, leaving them alone again in their bubble of uncomfortable proximity. "I hired her," Weston said suddenly. "What?" "Marisol Santos. I called her this morning and offered her a position in our IT department. Probationary, with a mentor assigned. But still," he turned to look directly at her. "You were right. I should have looked at her work instead of her history." Sutton felt something warm unfurl in her chest. "Weston, thank you. Don't thank me yet. I also implemented a new policy requiring background checks to include rehabilitation program completion and references from community organizations. If we're going to take chances, we're going to be smart about it." She couldn't help but smile. "Of course you did. What's that supposed to mean?" "It means even when you do something from the heart, you have to systematize it." She softened her voice so he'd know she wasn't entirely teasing. "It's very you." Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or the beginning of a smile. "Is that criticism or observation?" "Both. Neither." She turned in her seat to face him more fully. "I've been thinking, too, about what you said yesterday about having to be the responsible one." Weston's posture straightened almost imperceptibly. "Sutton, no. Let me say this." She took a breath, choosing her words carefully. "I never realized how different our experiences were after they died. I was so focused on my own grief that I didn't see yours. I managed fine." "Did you?" She studied his face, noting the way his jaw tightened when she pushed. "When was the last time you took a vacation, Weston? A real one, not a business trip disguised as leisure. I don't need. When was the last time you went on a date that wasn't a networking opportunity?" His silence stretched long enough to be an answer. "When was the last time you did something just because it made you happy? Happiness is a luxury I can't afford." The words came out sharper than he'd probably intended. "This company will survive if you take a weekend off occasionally." Sutton leaned forward, wishing she could reach across the space between them and touch his hand. "Our fathers built this place because they loved the work, not because they were martyrs to it. Our fathers didn't inherit a billion-dollar responsibility at 22. No, but they would have wanted their sons to have lives outside of quarterly reports." Weston was quiet for a long moment, looking out his own window at the carpet of clouds below. When he spoke again, his voice was softer. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if they'd lived longer, if they'd had time to teach us how to work together instead of leaving us to figure it out on our own." "We would have fought anyway," Sutton said, surprising herself with her honesty. "We've been disagreeing since we were kids. Remember the summer you were 15 and I was 11, and you spent the entire company picnic explaining to me why my lemonade stand was economically inefficient?" That earned her an almost smile. "You were charging 50 cents for a cup that cost you 12 cents to make. Your profit margins were unsustainable. I was 11. Economics doesn't care about age, and this is exactly what I'm talking about." But she was laughing now, remembering the earnest teenage boy who'd drawn charts on napkins to explain supply and demand to a kid who just wanted to buy candy with her lemonade money. "You've been trying to optimize the world since you could walk. Someone has to. Not everything needs optimizing, Weston." He turned to look at her again, and this time she caught something vulnerable in his expression. "Doesn't it? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like the things that don't get optimized are the things that fall apart." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Sutton realized they weren't just talking about business anymore. "Is that what you think happened to us?" she asked quietly. "That we fell apart because we weren't optimized?" "I think we fell apart because we never learned how to be partners instead of competitors." The plane began its descent, and Sutton felt her ears pop as the pressure changed. Outside, she could see the sprawl of Toronto growing larger below them, all concrete and glass and millions of people living their own complicated lives. "The presentation today," she said. "What if we actually try to be partners? Just for one afternoon?" Weston raised an eyebrow. "Are you suggesting we agree with each other in public?" "I'm suggesting we stop trying to win and start trying to succeed." He considered this, and she could almost see him running calculations in his head, weighing risks and benefits, analyzing potential outcomes. "All right," he said finally. "Partners. For one afternoon." "Partners," she agreed, extending her hand across the narrow aisle. He shook it, his grip firm and warm, and for just a moment, Sutton felt like they were kids again, before the weight of legacy and responsibility and grief had built walls between them, before they'd forgotten that they were supposed to be on the same side. The plane touched down with a gentle bump, and, as they taxied toward the gate, Sutton found herself wondering if maybe, just maybe, one afternoon of partnership might turn into something more. But as she watched Weston check his phone and slip back into CEO mode, she reminded herself not to hope for too much. After all, some things were too broken to fix with just one handshake. The conference hall in Toronto buzzed with the kind of energy that only came from putting 300 successful people in one room and asking them to share their secrets. Sutton adjusted her microphone as she stepped up to the podium, scanning the sea of faces in the audience. Business leaders, entrepreneurs, academics, all waiting to hear how she and Weston had built their father's small environmental consulting firm into a billion-dollar empire, if only they knew the truth. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "7 years ago, my business partner and I inherited something that looked like a gift, but felt like a burden." She glanced at Weston, who stood beside her in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his posture confident and controlled. They'd rehearsed this presentation 3 times in the hotel business center that morning, and for once, they'd managed to get through it without a single argument. Maybe their airplane truce was actually working. "The company our fathers founded represented everything we believed in," Weston continued smoothly, picking up the thread. "Innovation, sustainability, social responsibility. But believing in something and knowing how to lead it are 2 very different challenges." A woman in the 3rd row leaned forward, obviously intrigued. Sutton felt the familiar rush that came from commanding a room's attention. "We made mistakes," she said. "A lot of them. We disagreed on strategy, on hiring, on the fundamental question of whether business should be driven by profit or purpose. The answer, we learned, is both," Weston said. "Purpose without profit is just a hobby. Profit without purpose is just greed." It was a good line. They'd crafted it together that morning over coffee and bagels, and Sutton felt a small surge of pride at how well it landed. The audience murmured appreciation. "But perhaps the most important lesson we learned," she continued, "is that ethical leadership isn't about having the right answers. It's about being willing to ask the hard questions, especially of yourself." She was hitting her stride now, feeling the energy in the room build as she talked about transparency and corporate decision-making, about the responsibility that came with success, about the importance of remembering that behind every quarterly report were real people with real lives. "Ms. Hale," came a voice from the audience. "That's a beautiful sentiment, but how do you balance idealism with practical business decisions? Surely there are times when doing the right thing conflicts with doing the profitable thing." Sutton smiled, recognizing the challenge. "That's an excellent question. Weston, you want to take this one?" But as she turned toward him, she saw something flicker across his face, a tightness around his eyes that she recognized as his tell when he was about to disagree with something she'd said. "Don't," she thought. "Not here. Not now." "Actually," Weston said, his voice measured but firm, "I think that question highlights a fundamental flaw in how we often approach business ethics." Sutton felt her stomach drop. This wasn't part of their script. "The assumption that idealism and profitability are inherently in conflict," he continued, "suggests that we see moral decision-making as a luxury we can only afford when business is good. But what if the opposite were true? What if ethical leadership isn't about choosing between profit and purpose, but about being smart enough to find solutions that serve both?" Relief flooded through her. He wasn't disagreeing. He was building on her point, making it stronger. "For example," Weston said, clicking to their next slide, 3 years ago we had to decide whether to continue using a supplier who offered us significant cost savings, but whose labor practices were questionable. The easy choice would have been to keep the contract and boost our margins. Instead, Sutton picked up seamlessly. We invested in developing local suppliers who met our ethical standards. It cost us more upfront, but it resulted in better quality control, stronger community relationships, and ultimately, a more sustainable business model. And better sleep at night, Weston added with the faintest smile. The audience laughed, and Sutton felt something warm settle in her chest. This was how it was supposed to feel, not like a competition, but like a collaboration. Not like two people fighting for control, but like two halves of a whole. "I have a question about leadership styles," called out a man in the back row. "You two clearly have very different approaches. Ms. Hale, you seem to lead with your heart, while Mr. Carrick appears more analytical. How do you prevent that from creating conflict?" Sutton glanced at Weston, and for just a moment they shared a look that acknowledged the irony of the question. "We don't," she said honestly. "Conflict isn't always destructive. Sometimes it's necessary. The key," Weston said, "is learning to fight about the right things. We might disagree about strategy or implementation, but we never disagree about our core values or our commitment to the company's mission." It wasn't entirely true. They disagreed about plenty of core things over the years. But standing there in front of hundreds of people, presenting a united front for perhaps the first time in their professional lives, Sutton found herself wishing it were true. "Different perspectives make us stronger," she said, surprised by how much she meant it. "I push him to consider the human impact of our decisions. He pushes me to consider the long-term sustainability of our choices. We balance each other," Weston agreed, and something in his voice made her look at him more closely. "Any final thoughts you'd like to leave us with?" asked the moderator. Sutton stepped forward, feeling the weight of 300 pairs of eyes on her. "Leadership isn't about having all the answers," she said. "It's about surrounding yourself with people who challenge you to ask better questions. It's about being brave enough to admit when you're wrong, and humble enough to learn from your mistakes." She paused, looking directly at Weston. "And sometimes it's about being willing to trust someone you never thought you could work with." The applause was thunderous, and as they stepped away from the podium together, Sutton felt something she hadn't experienced in years: pride in what they'd accomplished together. But as they made their way toward the reception area, she noticed Weston checking his phone with a frown. "What is it?" she asked. "Weather alert. There's a major storm system moving in. Flights are being delayed indefinitely." Sutton looked out the hotel's floor-to-ceiling windows at the darkening sky, where the first fat snowflakes were beginning to fall. "How long indefinitely? Could be hours. Could be overnight." He slipped his phone back into his pocket. "Looks like we're stuck here for a while." And as the wind picked up outside, rattling the windows with a sound like dice being shaken, Sutton had the strangest feeling that the weather was the least unpredictable thing about to happen. The hotel lobby looked like a scene from a disaster movie. Travelers sprawled across every available chair, sleeping bags unrolled near charging stations, and a line of increasingly frustrated people stretching from the front desk to the revolving doors. "I'm sorry, but that's absolutely impossible," the hotel manager was saying to a red-faced businessman. "We're completely booked. The storm has stranded everyone." Sutton watched Weston navigate through the chaos with the same calm efficiency he brought to board meetings. He'd been on his phone for the past 20 minutes, calling airlines, car rental companies, even train services. Nothing was moving in or out of Toronto until the blizzard passed. "Any luck?" she asked when he rejoined her near the concierge desk. "The airport's closed until at least tomorrow afternoon. Highway 401 is shut down completely." He ran a hand through his hair, and she noticed it was the first time she'd seen him look genuinely disheveled. "I managed to get us on a standby list for the first flight out, but we're stuck. We're stuck." Sutton looked around at the sea of stranded travelers and felt a familiar knot of anxiety in her chest. She hated being trapped anywhere, but being trapped with Weston, after the strange intimacy of their successful presentation, felt particularly unsettling. "At least we have rooms," she said, trying to stay positive. "Actually," Weston's expression grew uncomfortable. "That's complicated." "What do you mean, complicated?" "I mean the hotel made an error with our reservations. They only have one room available for us tonight." Sutton stared at him. "One room?" "The executive suite. Apparently it was booked under the company name, not our individual names, and they assumed—" He trailed off, looking anywhere but at her face. "They assumed we were together." The words came out flatter than she'd intended. "The manager offered to set up a cot in the business center, but with the generator issues they're having," he shrugged helplessly. "It's the suite, or sleeping in the lobby with everyone else." Sutton glanced around at the chaos. Crying children, snoring strangers, the faint smell of fast food and anxiety permeating everything. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. Fine, the suite. She grabbed her overnight bag with more force than necessary. But I get the bed. Actually, it has 2 bedrooms. Oh, she felt heat creep up her neck. Of course it does. The elevator ride to the 32nd floor was silent except for the soft jazz music that seemed designed to calm frayed nerves. It wasn't working. The executive suite was exactly what Sutton had expected. All marble surfaces and floor-to-ceiling windows, with a living area that could have hosted a small cocktail party and a view of Lake Ontario that would have been breathtaking if it weren't currently obscured by swirling snow. "This is nice," she said awkwardly, setting her bag down near the entrance. "Very." Weston was already pulling out his laptop. "I have some calls to make. Quarterly projections to review." "Weston." She turned to face him. "It's almost 9 o'clock on a Thursday night. You're stranded in a hotel room during a blizzard. Maybe you could try not working for a few hours." "I don't really do not working. I've noticed." She moved to the window, watching the snow swirl in the streetlights below. "When's the last time you just sat still?" "I sit still. In meetings don't count. I sit still in other places." "Name one." He was quiet for so long that she turned around to look at him. He was standing in the middle of the living room, still holding his laptop, looking like a man who'd just realized he couldn't answer a simple question about his own life. "I read," he said finally. "When?" "Before bed. Usually. Business journals don't count. Sometimes I read other things." "Like what?" Another long pause. "Fiction. Sometimes." Sutton felt something soften in her chest. "What kind of fiction?" "It doesn't matter." He opened his laptop with sharp movements. "I really do need to review these projections." "Weston." She crossed the room and gently closed his laptop. "What kind of fiction?" He looked at her for a moment, and she could see him weighing whether to deflect again or tell the truth. "Mystery novels," he said quietly. "Old ones, mostly. Agatha Christie. Raymond Chandler." "Really? Don't sound so surprised. I'm capable of enjoying things that don't have profit margins. I'm not surprised that you read them. I'm surprised that you admitted it." She settled into one of the leather armchairs, curling her legs under her. "What else don't I know about you?" "That's a dangerous question." "Why?" "Because you might not like the answers." The room fell quiet, except for the wind howling outside and the faint hum of the heating system. Sutton studied Weston's face in the soft lamplight, noting the way his jaw tensed when he was trying to decide how much to reveal. "Try me," she said. He set his laptop aside and moved to the window, hands clasped behind his back in that way that meant he was thinking hard about something. "I hate quinoa," he said finally. "What?" "Quinoa. Everyone assumes I eat it because it's healthy and efficient, but it tastes like punishment." He glanced at her over his shoulder. "I'd rather eat pizza." Despite everything, Sutton found herself smiling. "That's your deep, dark secret? You don't like superfoods?" "I also..." He turned around, leaning against the window frame. "I still have my father's office exactly the way he left it. Same papers on the desk, same coffee mug, same jacket hanging on the back of his chair. I tell people it's storage space, but I go in there sometimes and just sit." The admission hit her like a physical blow. She'd had no idea that room still existed, much less that Weston visited it. "I kept my dad's reading glasses," she said softly. "They're in my desk drawer. Sometimes I hold them when I'm making difficult decisions, like maybe I can channel some of his wisdom. Does it work? Not really, but it makes me feel less alone." Weston was quiet for a moment, studying her face with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You're not what I expected," he said finally. "What did you expect?" "Someone easier to dismiss." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Outside the storm raged on, but inside the suite something was shifting. Some wall that had been built brick by brick over years of misunderstanding was starting to show cracks, and Sutton had the terrifying, exhilarating feeling that before this night was over, that wall might come down completely. The room service cart arrived at 10:30, wheeled in by a cheerful woman who seemed completely unfazed by the chaos downstairs. "Compliments of the hotel management," she announced, setting out plates of artisanal cheese, fresh bread, and, Sutton noticed with amusement, a bottle of very expensive red wine. "For our stranded VIP guests." When the woman left, Sutton found herself standing in the elegant dining area with Weston, both of them staring at the spread like it might explode. "We should probably eat something," she said finally. "Probably." but neither of them moved. The food felt like a commitment to spending the evening together, to continuing whatever conversation they'd started, to acknowledging that they were trapped here until morning, with nothing but each other for company. "I'll open the wine," Weston said, reaching for the bottle with the kind of decisive movement that usually meant he was trying not to overthink something. "You don't have to. It's been the kind of day that calls for wine." He found the corkscrew in the drawer and began working on the cork with practiced efficiency. "Besides, maybe it'll make this less awkward." "Is it awkward?" He paused in his cork pulling to look at her. "Isn't it?" She considered this. "A little, but not in a bad way." The cork came free with a soft pop, and Weston poured 2 glasses of wine that gleamed dark red in the lamplight. He handed one to her, and their fingers brushed for just a moment. Warm skin against warm skin, there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "To being stranded," he said, raising his glass. "To unexpected partnerships," she countered. They drank, and the wine was perfect, rich and smooth with just enough bite to remind you it was there. Sutton felt some of the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. "This is good," she said, settling onto the couch with her plate of cheese and bread. "Hotel management has excellent taste." Weston took the chair across from her and she noticed he'd loosened his tie and rolled up his sleeves. It was the most casual she'd ever seen him outside of the storage room encounter. "So," she said, tucking her feet under her, "mystery novels. How did that start?" "You really want to know?" "I really want to know." He took a sip of wine, as if deciding how much to reveal. "When I was 12, I had pneumonia, bad enough that I was hospitalized for a week. My dad brought me a stack of his old paperbacks to keep me occupied." "Your father read mystery novels?" "Voraciously. Had a whole collection hidden behind the business books in his office." Weston's smile was soft with memory. He said they helped him think better, that following someone else's logical deductions sharpened his own problem-solving skills. "That's actually brilliant." "It is. I've been reading them ever since." He paused. "Though I don't usually advertise the fact." "Why not?" "Because it doesn't fit the image." Sutton studied his face over the rim of her wineglass. "What image?" "You know what image. The cold, calculating CEO who only cares about profit margins and efficiency reports. Is that really what you think people see when they look at you? Isn't it what you see?" The question hung between them, and Sutton realized he genuinely wanted an answer. Not a diplomatic one, but an honest one. "I used to," she said slowly, "but not anymore." "What changed?" "Today mostly. Watching you in the presentation, seeing how you built on my ideas instead of tearing them down. Realizing that maybe we've been so busy fighting each other that we forgot we were supposed to be on the same side." Weston was quiet for a moment, turning his wine glass in his hands. "I never wanted to fight with you," he said finally. "Then why did we?" "Because," he set down his glass and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Because when my father died, everyone expected me to become him overnight. And when I looked at you, I saw everything I thought I had to give up to be worthy of his legacy." "What do you mean?" "You care so openly. You make decisions with your heart and somehow they turn out right more often than they should." His voice grew quieter. "You're everything I trained myself not to be." Sutton felt something twist in her chest. "Weston, I'm not finished." He looked directly at her and she saw something raw in his expression. "I told myself that caring too much was a luxury I couldn't afford, that emotions were inefficient, that the best leaders were the ones who could make hard choices without flinching. But watching you these past few days," he trailed off, shaking his head. "What?" She pressed gently. "You make the hard choices too. You just don't pretend they don't cost you something." The wind rattled the windows and snow continued to swirl outside like the world was being erased and rewritten. Inside the suite, the silence stretched between them, full of things neither of them seemed ready to say. "Can I tell you something?" Sutton asked. "Yes. I've always been a little bit afraid of you." His eyebrows rose. "Afraid of me?" "Not afraid like I think you'll hurt me. Afraid like," she searched for the right words, "like you see things so clearly that you might see right through me and realize I have no idea what I'm doing half the time." "You think I have any idea what I'm doing? Don't you?" "Sutton," his laugh was rueful, "I've been making it up as I go along for 7 years. The difference is that I'm better at hiding it." She stared at him, this man she'd worked beside for so long, and realized she was seeing him clearly for the first time. Not the polished CEO or the cold strategist, but someone who'd been carrying the same fears and doubts she had, just in a different way. "We're a mess," she said softly. "We are. Our fathers would probably be horrified." Probably. He picked up his wine glass again and she noticed his hand wasn't entirely steady. Or maybe they'd understand better than we think. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the suite, something had shifted. The air felt charged, like the moment before lightning strikes, full of potential and danger and the promise that nothing would be the same afterward. And as Sutton met Weston's eyes across the coffee table, she realized they were standing at the edge of something that couldn't be undone. The question was whether they were brave enough to jump. The wine glass slipped from Sutton's fingers. It happened in slow motion, the crystal tumbling through the air, dark liquid arcing out like spilled secrets, both of them lunging forward to catch what couldn't be caught. Their hands collided over the coffee table, wine splashing across expensive marble, and suddenly they were inches apart, breathing the same air close enough that she could see flecks of gold in his gray eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though she wasn't sure what she was apologizing for. "Don't be." His voice was rough, different than she'd ever heard it. Neither of them moved to clean up the mess. Neither of them moved at all, except for the slight tremor in Weston's hand where it covered hers, warm and solid and impossible to ignore. Sutton. Her name on his lips sounded like a question and a prayer and a warning all at once. I know. She did know. Knew they were standing at the edge of something that would change everything. Knew that smart people would step back. Knew that she'd never been particularly smart about the things that mattered. "This is a terrible idea," he said, but his thumb was tracing across her knuckles, sending electricity straight up her arm. "The worst. It'll complicate everything. Everything's already complicated." Outside, thunder rolled across the lake, snow turning to sleet against the windows with a sound like time running out. Inside, the world had narrowed to this, his hand on hers, the space between them crackling with 7 years of unresolved tension. "Tell me to stop," he said quietly. Instead, she closed the distance between them. The kiss was nothing like she'd imagined. Not soft or tentative, but fierce and desperate, like they were drowning, and each other was air. His hand slid into her hair, and she could taste wine and possibility and the salt of tears she didn't remember shedding. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Weston rested his forehead against hers. "What are we doing?" he whispered. "I don't know." Her hands had somehow found their way to his chest, could feel his heart racing beneath her palms. "I don't care. You should care. We should both care. Should we?" She pulled back just far enough to look at him, to see the want and confusion and something deeper warring in his expression. "When's the last time you did something just because you wanted to? Not because it was smart or strategic or good for the company, but just because it felt right?" "I can't remember." "Then maybe it's time." He kissed her again, softer this time but no less intense, and she felt something inside her chest unfurl like a flower that had been waiting years for sunlight. This was Weston, controlled, calculating Weston, and he was coming apart in her arms like he'd been holding himself together by sheer force of will for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to just feel. "You're going to regret this," he said against her lips. "Are you? Ask me tomorrow." But his hands were pulling her closer, and she was letting him, was helping him, was climbing onto his lap in the leather chair like she belonged there, like this was something they'd done 1,000 times before instead of something that was rewriting the entire story of who they were to each other. The storm outside seemed to be getting worse, but Sutton barely heard it over the sound of her own heartbeat, over the soft sounds Weston made when she kissed the hollow of his throat, over the whispered endearments that sounded like they were surprising him as much as they were her. "Sutton," he breathed. And she loved the way her name sounded in his voice when it wasn't filtered through boardroom politeness or professional distance. "I'm here. I know. That's what scares me." She pulled back to look at him, to study the face she'd seen across conference tables and in newspapers and in her dreams more often than she cared to admit. In the soft light of the hotel suite, with his perfect hair mussed and his tie completely undone, he looked younger, more vulnerable, more real. "You don't have to be scared," she said, tracing the line of his jaw with her fingertip. "Not tonight. What about tomorrow? Tomorrow we figure it out. What if we can't? What if this ruins everything?" She kissed him again, slow and deliberate, pouring 7 years of hidden longing into the space between them. What if it saves everything instead? Outside, the storm raged on. Wind and ice, and the kind of weather that stranded people together and forced them to confront truths they'd been avoiding. Inside, 2 people who'd spent years building walls between them finally let those walls crumble. And for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, they stopped thinking about consequences and started thinking about possibilities. The wine stain on the marble table would be there in the morning, a reminder of the moment everything changed. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight there was only this: the feel of his hands on her face, the taste of wine and promise on his lips, and the terrifying, exhilarating realization that maybe, just maybe, the thing they'd been fighting all these years wasn't each other at all. Maybe it was themselves. Sutton woke up alone. The first thing she noticed was the light. Pale winter sunlight streaming through the hotel suite's windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny ghosts in the air. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world that looked scrubbed clean and impossibly bright. The second thing she noticed was the silence. She sat up slowly, pulling the sheet around her shoulders, and looked around the bedroom that smelled like expensive cologne and possibility. Weston's clothes were gone from the chair where he'd left them last night. His shoes were missing from beside the bed. A terrible, familiar coldness began to creep up from her stomach. She found her clothes scattered across the living room floor, her blouse draped over the back of the couch, her skirt puddled near the coffee table where a wine stain still marked the marble like evidence of everything that had changed. She dressed quickly, fingers fumbling with buttons that seemed determined not to cooperate. There was a note on the kitchen counter, written in Weston's precise handwriting on hotel stationery. S. Flight leaves at 11:30. Car will be here at 9:45. See you at the airport. That was it. No explanation, no acknowledgement of what had happened between them, no indication that the night had meant anything more to him than a temporary lapse in judgment. Sutton crumpled the note and threw it in the trash, then immediately retrieved it and smoothed it out again. She stared at the single initial he'd used to sign it. Not his full name, not even Weston, just W, like he was already retreating back into professional distance. Her phone buzzed with a text from the car service. Vehicle arriving in 5 minutes for airport departure. 5 minutes. She had 5 minutes to put herself back together, to become the composed executive who could sit beside him on a plane and pretend that nothing had fundamentally shifted between them. She failed completely. The ride to the airport was a masterclass in awkward silence. Weston sat on the far side of the black sedan, staring out his window at the snow-covered city while Sutton pretended to be fascinated by her phone. The driver, clearly sensing the tension, had turned the radio up just loud enough to provide cover for the things they weren't saying to each other. When Weston did speak, it was about business. The quarterly reports need to be finalized by Wednesday, he said, his voice carefully neutral. I'll have my assistant send you the preliminary figures. Fine. Sutton didn't look up from her phone. And we need to schedule a meeting about the Denver expansion. Early next week, if possible. I'll check my calendar. Good. Another silence. This one even more loaded than the last. As they approached the terminal, Sutton caught herself watching Weston's reflection in the window, noting the tight set of his jaw, the way he kept checking his watch, the careful space he maintained between them on the leather seat. This was how it was going to be then. They were going to pretend it never happened. The first-class lounge was mercifully quiet, filled with the kind of business travelers who understood that morning flights called for silence and strong coffee. Sutton claimed a corner table and buried herself in emails, trying to ignore the fact that Weston had chosen a seat on the opposite side of the room. She was responding to a message from her assistant when a shadow fell across her table. Sutton. She looked up to find Weston standing beside her chair, coffee cup in hand, expression unreadable. Yes? We need to talk. Do we? About what happened? Nothing happened. The words came out sharper than she'd intended, but she didn't take them back. We were stuck in a hotel room during a storm. We drank too much wine. People make mistakes. Something flickered across his face. Hurt, maybe, or disappointment. But it was gone so quickly she couldn't be sure. Right? He said quietly. A mistake. Exactly. He nodded once, then walked away without another word. Seat 3A had never felt so far from Seat 3C. They boarded the plane in silence, stowed their carry-on bags in silence, fastened their seat belts in silence. When the flight attendant offered them champagne, Sutton asked for coffee instead. Black coffee, like the mood that had settled over her like a heavy coat. Halfway through the flight, she made the mistake of glancing over at Weston. He was working naturally, laptop open, fingers moving across the keyboard with mechanical precision. But there was something different about his posture, something that looked less like focus and more like desperation. As if he could feel her watching, he looked up. Their eyes met for just a moment, long enough for her to see something raw and unguarded in his expression before he looked away again. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into Seattle, came the captain's voice over the intercom. Local time is 2:15 p.m., and it's currently 42 degrees with partly cloudy skies. 42 degrees and partly cloudy. Normal Seattle weather. Normal life, waiting for them below the clouds. But as the plane descended toward the familiar city skyline, Sutton realized that nothing about her life felt normal anymore. She'd spent one night in Weston's arms, and it had changed something fundamental inside her, something that couldn't be unchanged with morning light and careful distance. The worst part was that she could see it in him too, in the careful way he avoided looking at her, in the tension in his shoulders, in the fact that he'd ordered coffee instead of his usual tea. He was just better at pretending than she was. They parted ways at baggage claim without ceremony. Weston's driver was waiting with a black sedan. Sutton had called her own car service. Professional courtesy, professional distance, professional denial of everything that had shifted between them. "See you Monday," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Monday," she agreed. But as she watched him disappear into the Seattle afternoon, Sutton couldn't shake the feeling that the man getting into that sedan wasn't the same one who'd kissed her like she was air, and he'd been drowning. That man, vulnerable, passionate, real, had vanished with the morning light, and she had no idea how to get him back. The boardroom had never felt like a battlefield before, but on Monday morning, it felt like a place where wars were declared. Sutton sat across from Weston at the polished conference table, surrounded by 12 other board members who had no idea they were witnessing the aftermath of everything falling apart. The quarterly presentation materials were spread between them like evidence in a case neither of them wanted to argue. "The sustainability initiatives have exceeded projections by 41%, Weston said, his voice crisp and professional as he clicked through slides. "Customer satisfaction is up, operational costs are down, and we're on track to meet annual revenue goals 2 months ahead of schedule." He looked directly at her for the first time since they'd returned from Toronto. "Ms. Hale has some additional insights about employee engagement metrics." The formality in his voice, "Ms. Hale," like they were strangers who'd just met, hit her like a physical blow. "Thank you, Mr. Carrick. Two could play this game. Our employee satisfaction surveys show marked improvement in most departments, but there's been a concerning dip in management trust scores." She pulled up her own slides, noting how Weston's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly when she emphasized the word trust. "Employees are reporting feeling disconnected from leadership decisions," she continued, looking directly at him. "There seems to be a perception that management isn't being transparent about company direction." "Interesting," Weston said, his tone suggesting it was anything but. "Perhaps that has more to do with unclear communication from leadership than actual policy issues. Or perhaps it has to do with leadership being unwilling to acknowledge when there are real problems that need addressing." The other board members began shifting uncomfortably in their seats. This was supposed to be a routine quarterly review, not whatever psychological warfare was playing out between the two CEOs. "I think we should table this discussion," suggested Harold Manning, the chairman of the board, clearing his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps you two could work out the specifics offline and report back." "Actually," Sutton said, standing up abruptly, "I'd like to propose a more significant restructuring of our leadership model." The room went dead silent. "I'm sorry?" Harold looked genuinely confused. "I'm proposing that we eliminate the co-CEO structure entirely." Sutton's voice was steady, but inside she felt like she was throwing herself off a cliff. "It's clearly not working. The company would be better served by a single leader with clear authority." Weston's face had gone completely blank, the expression he wore when he was calculating outcomes at lightning speed. "That's a rather dramatic suggestion," Harold said carefully. "Are you volunteering to step down, Ms. Hale? I'm suggesting we let the board decide which of us is better suited to lead this company moving forward." The silence that followed was deafening. Sutton could hear her own heartbeat, could feel every pair of eyes in the room moving between her and Weston like spectators at a tennis match. "I see." Weston's voice was deadly quiet. "And you think this is the appropriate venue for a coup attempt?" "It's not a coup. It's a recognition that this partnership isn't sustainable. Because of one disagreement about employee metrics? Because you can't separate personal and professional decisions." The words exploded out of her before she could stop them. "Because you run this company like you run your life, with complete emotional detachment." The room erupted in uncomfortable murmurs. Harold was calling for order. Other board members were demanding explanations, but all Sutton could see was Weston's face going white with what looked like fury. "I think we need a recess," Harold announced firmly. Everyone except Ms. Hale and Mr. Carrick, please step out for 15 minutes. The board members filed out quickly, clearly relieved to escape whatever explosion was about to happen. When the door closed behind the last person, the silence was so complete that Sutton could hear the heating system cycling on. What the hell was that? Weston's voice was low and dangerous. That was me trying to save this company from your inability to function like a human being. My inability. He stood up so fast his chair rolled backward. You want to talk about inability to function? You just tried to stage a hostile takeover in front of the entire board because you can't handle the fact that what happened in Toronto was a mistake. A mistake? The word came out like a slap. Is that really what you think it was? What else would it be? I don't know, Weston. Maybe something real for once in your carefully calculated life. Real? He laughed, but it was a bitter sound. You want to know what's real? Real is the fact that we have 3,000 employees who depend on us making smart decisions. Real is the fact that our fathers built this company on trust and partnership, not on whatever twisted game you're playing right now. I'm not playing a game. Then what do you call this? This is me refusing to pretend anymore. She moved around the table toward him, propelled by 7 years of frustration and 3 days of heartbreak. This is me being tired of watching you turn everything meaningful into a business transaction. That's what business is, Sutton. Transactions, data, results. He was shouting now, his perfect composure finally cracking. It's not poetry and feelings and whatever fantasy you've constructed about what we were doing. So that's it? You're just going to pretend it meant nothing? It meant nothing because it can't mean anything. He slammed his hand down on the conference table hard enough to make the water glasses jump. We run a company together. We can't afford to... To what? To care about each other? To be reckless? When did caring become reckless to you? The day my father died and left me responsible for everything he'd built. The words tore out of him like they'd been buried so deep he'd forgotten they existed. The day I realized that people who lead with their hearts end up destroying everything they touch. Sutton stared at him, seeing him clearly for the first time since they'd returned from Toronto. Not the composed CEO or the passionate man from their hotel room, but someone who was terrified of his own capacity to feel. You think caring about me would destroy the company? She asked quietly. I think caring about anyone is a luxury I can't afford. That's not living, Weston. That's just existing. Maybe that's all I'm capable of. The words hung between them like a confession and a surrender all at once. Outside the conference room, she could hear the muffled voices of the board members waiting in the hallway, probably debating whether they should call security or just pretend this wasn't happening. You know what? Sutton said finally, her voice steady despite the tears she could feel threatening. You're right. This partnership isn't working. Weston's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. But not because we disagree about business, she continued. Because you're so afraid of feeling something real that you'd rather burn it all down than risk being vulnerable. She walked toward the door, then paused with her hand on the handle. For what it's worth, I don't think caring about me would destroy anything. I think it might be the first honest thing you've done in years. She opened the door and stepped into the hallway, leaving Weston alone with the silence and the weight of everything they'd just shattered. And for the first time since her father died, Sutton had no idea what happened next. 3 months later, the rain was falling in that gentle Seattle way that made everything look like a watercolor painting, and Sutton was running late for coffee. She ducked into Grind Coffee on Pine Street, shaking droplets from her umbrella and scanning the crowded cafe for an empty table. The Monday morning rush was in full swing, baristas calling out orders, the hiss of espresso machines, the comfortable chaos of people starting their weeks with caffeine and hope. She was reaching for her wallet when a voice behind her said, Sutton. She knew that voice, had been hearing it in her dreams for 3 months. She turned around slowly and there was Weston Carrick, standing by a corner table with 2 coffee cups and an expression she'd never seen before. Nervous, maybe, or something closer to hopeful. He looked different, still impeccably dressed, still devastatingly handsome, but there was something softer around his eyes, something less rigid in the way he held his shoulders. Hi, she said, because all the other words seemed to have disappeared. Hi, he gestured toward the cups. I got you a latte. Oat milk, 1 sugar. I hope it's still right. She moved toward the table, noting how he pulled out her chair, a gesture so automatic and gentlemanly that it made her chest tighten with memory. They sat in silence for a moment, the noise of the cafe swirling around them while they figured out how to be in the same space again. How are you? He asked finally. Good. Busy? She wrapped her hands around the warm cup. The transition has been smoother than expected. It had been, surprisingly. After their explosive confrontation in the boardroom, the board had voted to restructure the company leadership, not the dramatic overthrow Sutton had proposed in her anger, but a more nuanced arrangement. She would lead operations and strategic planning, while Weston focused on financial oversight and expansion. Still partners, but with clearer boundaries. Less opportunity for their personal complications to torpedo the business. "I heard about the Portland office," Weston said. "Congratulations." "Thank you, it was a team effort." "Sutton," his voice was quiet, serious. "Can I ask you something?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. "Do you remember what you said to me that last day? About caring being the first honest thing I'd done in years?" "I remember. You were right." He leaned forward, and she could see something raw and undefended in his expression. "I've been thinking about that conversation every day for 3 months. Weston, let me say this, please." He took a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep. "I spent so long thinking that caring was weakness. That feeling too much would make me a bad leader, a bad son, a bad keeper of my father's legacy. I convinced myself that the only way to honor what he built was to become someone who couldn't be hurt by loss." Rain continued to streak the windows, and Sutton found herself thinking about storms, how they could destroy things, but also how they cleared the air. "But the thing about not letting yourself care," Weston continued, "is that you end up not living either. You end up going through the motions of a life without ever actually experiencing it." "What changed?" she asked softly. "You did." He reached across the table, and she let him take her hand. "That night in Toronto, you made me remember what it felt like to be human. And then I was so terrified of that feeling that I tried to bury it." His thumb traced across her knuckles, and she remembered another hotel room, another conversation, another moment when they'd been brave enough to be real with each other. "I miss you," he said simply. "I miss fighting with you about employee policies, and I miss the way you make me think about things differently, and I miss—" He paused. "I miss the person I was when I was with you." Sutton felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. "Weston, I know I hurt you. I know I handled everything wrong after Toronto. I know I don't deserve a second chance." His grip on her hand tightened. "But I'm asking for one anyway." She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the polished CEO or the man who'd run from intimacy, but someone who was finally, genuinely offering himself without armor. "What are you asking for exactly?" she said. "I'm asking if you'd have dinner with me. Not a business dinner, not a board meeting, not a professional obligation." His smile was tentative but real. "Just dinner. With someone who's finally figured out that the scariest thing isn't caring too much, it's not caring at all." Outside, the rain was beginning to ease, and patches of blue were starting to show through the gray clouds. Sutton thought about second chances, about forgiveness, about the difference between the safe choice and the right choice. "One dinner," she said finally. "One dinner. But I have conditions." "Name them." "No phones, no business talk, and you have to promise me something." "What?" "Promise me you'll tell me about the last book you read that wasn't related to quarterly projections or market analysis." Weston's laugh was surprised and genuine. "Deal. But only if you promise to tell me what you're really thinking, not what you think I want to hear." "I can do that." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, hands still linked across the small table, watching the Seattle morning come alive outside the cafe windows. "Sutton," Weston said quietly. "Yes? Our fathers would have wanted us to be happy. I think you're right. Even if happiness is messy and inefficient and impossible to quantify in a spreadsheet? Especially then." He squeezed her hand and she squeezed back, and for the first time in months, Sutton felt like she could breathe fully again. Because some things, the most important things, couldn't be optimized or systematized or controlled. Some things could only be built with patience and trust and the courage to keep trying, even when it would be easier to walk away. Some things were worth the risk of caring. "So," Weston said, his eyes bright with something that looked like hope. "Friday night?" "Friday night," she agreed. And as they walked out into the clearing Seattle morning together, Sutton realized that maybe the most revolutionary thing they could do wasn't to build a bigger company or generate higher profits or impress more boards of directors. Maybe the most revolutionary thing was to build a life, messy and complicated and gloriously, inefficiently human, together. What did you learn from this story? Would you have the courage to love someone who challenged everything you thought you knew about yourself? Your participation in this channel is very important. Please leave your opinion in the comments. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below letting us know what you thought. Your feedback and support mean a lot to us. Stay tuned for more exciting stories.